Welcome to the Roaming History Podcast. Join us as we begin our look into the past. I'm your host, historian Logan Thomas. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Roaming History Podcast. I'm your host, Logan Thomas. I have been a historian for many years and a writer even longer than that. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this first episode, although it's kind of weird to call it the first episode because I've been working with students and writing for an audience for the better, actually more than 2 decades. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about me before we dive into history and tell you why I'm doing this. The Roaming History Podcast is essentially to share unforgettable stories in history for those people who claim to hate history. I'm going to try to make this as interesting as possible for you and try to sell you on the fact that history is not boring. It's not something that you should be afraid of. It's not something you should hate because, to tell you the truth, people say they hate history, but they really don't hate history. Everyone engages in history all the time. When you ask someone what they did over the weekend, you are engaging in history. Now, for many years, I've taught thousands of students, and they have always suggested that I should do a podcast for history. And then as time went on, some people said, oh, you should do something on Twitter, or you should do something on Instagram. And of course, I hear TikTok a lot. But I thought a podcast is something, I listen to them all the time, and I love listening to podcasts. I've always loved radio, even before, I'm showing my age there a little bit, but even before podcasts, I enjoyed radio. So this was a way for me to do what a lot of students have suggested to me, and some of them might be listening right now, so thank you for the suggestion. I am finally taking you up on that offer that many of you have mentioned to me. So I'm a historian. I have a PhD in history. I've been teaching at the college level in one way, shape, or form since around 2005. And before that, I was a journalist. Actually, during that, I was a journalist, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I was a historian. I've always enjoyed history, even before I got my graduate degrees in history. I've always enjoyed it. And it's kind of, I didn't choose history, it chose me. It's kind of something that I just got involved in and never really left. It's something that follows me everywhere I go. So as I started working with students, they started telling me that I should do a podcast. And a lot of them have already heard my voice on many videos, especially after the pandemic when we had to do videos. And I've been sharing different stories about history, things that I thought were cool, and just trying to get people to get a little excited about history. So, but when people ask me what I do, I don't usually say historian. I say I'm a writer. I have been writing professionally since 1999, and by the way, it is the summer of 2024 as I record this. So that means I have been doing this for 25 years as a professional writer. So I've written, as a journalist, I wrote all kinds of articles on every single beat you can imagine, from crime to government, to human interest stories. I did some stories on NASA. I even spent the night on a shrimp boat. I covered the Masters golf tournament here in Georgia. And by the way, I'm broadcasting right now from Georgia, USA. So I've written about everything. I've written novels. I have a space fantasy series under the pen name L.E. Thomas. I also have a pen name named Perry Kincaid. So I've written a lot of fiction, historical fiction, and mostly nonfiction. So that's a little bit about me. I'm sure we'll talk about it more as we go on in this journey of roaming through history. So what is the format of this podcast? What's the point? Since this is the first one, it's partially to entertain. But it's also going to be to educate. I'm hoping you'll come out of this saying, wow, I never thought about that before. This is something I didn't know about. And I'm going to try to give it to you in quick hits, so it's not going to be something that's too drawn out, something you'll be able to carry with you throughout the day. So I'm hoping you will find this podcast useful and entertaining. So when I started coming up with the idea of the first episode of the Roaming History Podcast, it was the 160th anniversary of the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, which is here in Georgia. Now, the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, you may or may not have heard of it. It was a major campaign or a major battle during the campaign, the Atlanta campaign, that is really most famous for burning down Atlanta and seeing the Union general, William Tecumseh Sherman, victorious in the early fall of 1864. The Battle of Kennesaw Mountain is probably the largest battle on the march toward Atlanta between the Confederate States of America and the United States of America. And this was during the American Civil War, depending on where you're listening to this. When you say Civil War in the United States, everyone automatically assumes the United States Civil War, when several states in the American South tried to break off from the United States of America. But the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain was very unique in this campaign, because most of the time there were no major battles. It was a campaign of maneuver, where Sherman was trying to keep the Confederate States occupied. He had direct orders from Union General Ulysses S. Grant to keep the Confederates occupied so they couldn't send reinforcements back to Virginia. And it was also, the goal was Atlanta as well. But Kennesaw Mountain, if you've ever been to Atlanta, Atlanta is a sprawling metropolis these days. And Kennesaw Mountain is this lovely, preserved area right in the middle of Atlanta. Well, it's actually north of Atlanta. But the battlefield is almost exactly the way it was in June of 1864. And that is one of the most amazing things to me about the Kennesaw Mountain battlefield, is because if you want to study the Atlanta campaign, you really can't go many places in Atlanta to see the Battle of Atlanta or the Battle of Peachtree Creek. It's been completely developed. If you want, the interstate, you have to stand in the middle of the interstate to see where some of the battlefield was. So you don't really, every now and then you'll find a construction project will find Sherman shells and they have to call in the bomb squad or something like that. But you don't really see the evidence of this American Civil War in Atlanta. But when you go to Kennesaw Mountain and you start marching, but when you start walking around those trails around the Kennesaw Mountain battlefield, you are transported back to 1864. And it is one of those amazing experiences when you get a chance to do that. So this podcast is going to be about what the battlefield is like today, how they preserved it, and a little bit about why in the world did Sherman decide to attack the Confederates at such a strong position. The Confederates were under the command of a general named Joseph Johnston. And Johnston was one of those generals that he knew he was outnumbered. So he wanted Sherman to come at him. And Sherman gave him exactly what he wanted along the Kennesaw line. And that is something that we're going to answer today. So here's what's coming up in this podcast. We're going to have a brief overview of the battle and an interview with park rangers on the preservation efforts. And this interview that I'm going to play for you took place a few years ago during the pandemic. So these park rangers were nice enough to conduct an interview with me when we were all wearing masks. But I really think you'll enjoy it when we're going to recognize the 160th anniversary of the battle. Then after that interview, we are going to go into a deeper dive into the reasons that Sherman decided to attack Kennesaw Mountain when he did. Because when you look back on it, it's easy to be the armchair general and look back on that and say, why'd you do that? That was such a terrible move, Sherman. Why did you attack? So we're going to do a deeper dive into the reasons, and that part's going to get pretty heavy in terms of Civil War terminology and historiography on Sherman's attack on Kennesaw Mountain. But first, we're going to play the interview with the park rangers, and I turned it into the podcast. I'm hoping you'll enjoy it. The park rangers were so nice to talk with me about this. So this is the beginning of our Kennesaw Mountain 160th anniversary of the battle podcast, and I hope you're going to enjoy it. And after that, we'll go into our deeper dive into the reasons Sherman decided to attack Kennesaw Mountain. By the time the sun set on June 27, 1864, approximately 4,000 Americans were killed or wounded on and around the base of Kennesaw Mountain. In the days that followed, the American Civil War would move beyond the Kennesaw Line, leaving behind a ravaged landscape, a landscape full of memory. In the end, the battle provided a momentary boost in Southern morale and faith in the hopes of the Confederate States of America. But any increase in Southern morale would be short-lived as the Union forces pushed on in the following weeks to within a few miles of Atlanta, the ultimate goal. Union General William Tecumseh Sherman made plans to invade Georgia from Chattanooga in early 1864. While the ultimate goal was taking the vital Confederate railroad hub of Atlanta, Sherman's newly promoted boss also wanted to ensure Southern General Joseph E. Johnston could not send reinforcements to the Army of Northern Virginia under Robert E. Lee. Sherman's newly promoted boss was Ulysses S. Grant, now in command of the entire Union war effort. Grant planned to launch simultaneous attacks against Confederate positions and bleed the rebel resources dry. Continuous campaigns, Grant believed, would prohibit the Southerners from successfully parrying every move. Sherman believed one of his chief objectives was to give full employment to Johnston. It makes but little difference where he is, so long as he is not on his way to Virginia. Sherman viewed Grant's strategy to orchestrate a sustained war effort on multiple fronts to be an enlightened war, and he hoped the '64 summer campaign would result in victories. An added layer of stress was President Abraham Lincoln's re-election campaign. A growing segment of the northern population had grown sick of the war. Calling themselves Copperheads, these anti-war individuals wanted an end to the suffering and dying. If they did not get what they desired, they vowed to elect a president who would put an end to the fighting. Lincoln needed victories, and he needed them now. Sherman began moving against Johnston in May of 1864. Historian James McPherson said Sherman faced logistical challenges with every mile he penetrated into Georgia, requiring him to place nearly the same number of men to protect his communication and supply lines as he had on the front lines to face Johnston's stubborn defenders. Sherman soon found himself locked in a war of maneuvers, stretching his supply lines thin. Rains bogged down the roads to further complicate matters. The general grew concerned as he repeatedly tried to skirmish and flank Johnston's forces, exposing an ever-lengthening supply line to guerrillas of what Sherman described as an exasperated people. The determined enemy strengthened with every withdrawal. Torrential rains made movement difficult, transforming a collage of muddy fields and slushy paths. Despite the rains, Sherman said the weather had a great impact on morale as it gave a break from the summer heat. But Sherman started to notice a disturbing pattern with his army at the same time. Every time the movement halted, the men entrenched and made elaborate earthworks for defense. Did this mean, Sherman wondered, his men no longer believed he would launch an attack if necessary? Had his army lost its fighting spirit? With supply lines stretched, following weeks of skirmishing and maneuvering, Sherman made the decision an attack should be tried. Johnston had set up extraordinary defensive positions all along the Kennesaw Line. Lieutenant Colonel D.F. Griffin of the 38th Indiana Veteran Volunteer Infantry Regiment believed in the efforts to attack Kennesaw Mountain. He placed great importance on the duty and the men's energy and cheerfulness. Another infantryman of the 9th Iowa supported Sherman's decision to attack, writing to his sister that at least some Union soldiers had realized a frontal assault would ultimately be necessary to dislodge the Confederates from their positions along the Kennesaw Line. Following days of planning, Sherman ordered approximately a fifth of his entire force to assault the enemy's defenses. Perhaps, Sherman hoped, Johnston had established his defenses too thin to repulse the assault. The assault happened on a very hot June 27, 1864. Fierce fighting raged up and down the Confederate defenses. Some of the heaviest fighting took place at a location that would later be known as the Dead Angle, where Union forces had nearly broken the rebel lines. But by the end of the day, Sherman's attack had failed. The result was one of the lowest points in his military career. 3,000 Union casualties had failed to dislodge the Confederates. The flanking and marching would soon resume. As years passed, former generals, soldiers, and historians argued over the merits of the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. Many veterans of the failed attack believed the operation was a necessary experiment to test the Confederate lines. But for the veterans, it remained a day they would never forget. After the war, years after the guns had fallen silent in Georgia, veterans returned to the trench works, remembering the struggle of that hot June day. Aspects of the battlefield still bore witness to the savage struggle. Union veterans started the first efforts of conserving the battlefield.
The first 60 acres was purchased in 1899 by veterans who actually fought here, and with the whole purpose of making it a battle park.
The torch of conservation passed from the veterans to the future generations in the 20th century, who hoped to preserve the battlefield near the sprawling metro Atlanta area. The Kennesaw Mountain National Battlefield Park is now nearly 3,000 acres.
The first preservation efforts would have started when the Park Service took over the management of the land. In some ways, the preservation efforts began in the 30s and still continue today.
Efforts are underway to preserve and protect the Wallace House. The Kennesaw Mountain Battlefield has worked for more than a decade to obtain the white painted old farmhouse, originally constructed in 1853.
It will be a great way to expound upon the interpretive programs that we already offer, being able to fully tell more stories.
The only Civil War structure that still exists within the park's boundaries was the location of a major skirmish days before the primary Battle of Kennesaw Mountain.
The exterior is 100% restored to its former glory.
The museum welcomes thousands of visitors each year and includes exhibits and a movie detailing the events of the battle.
The museum was redone and reopened in, I want to say, 2001 as part of the expansion of the visitor center. And it was a joint effort with staff here, as well as working with staff at the regional office in downtown Atlanta. And I believe a lot of the text and research for it not only came from the staff, but also from a professor at the University of Georgia. So it was very much a collaborative effort.
To enhance learning at the battlefield and bring history to the public, living history and interactive programs are regular events in the park.
Another part of my job is I'm the lead historic weapons safety supervisor for Kennesaw Mountain. The National Park Service takes their safety regarding living history very, very seriously. And so one of the things we do not do is reenactment. Where one side faces the other and they fire at each other. Part of that is for the safety component, because a lot of things can go wrong. But another one is just to respect the men and the other individuals who were here during that battle. They fought it once. It's really a family thing. A lot of the reenactors who come that are average volunteers, meaning they only come once a year. A lot of times they bring their families with them, and their families are part of it as well.
In the end, the park goes to great efforts to bring the history of Kennesaw Mountain to the public. It is their goal to remind today's generation of the sacrifices of the past?
I get so moved when I stand at the Illinois Monument, especially when there are kids present that we're doing programs for. Standing at the Illinois Monument and helping them to understand the sacrifices that were made on both sides, to help them understand the emotions that must have been going on that day of the battle. But looking from the Illinois Monument, looking down at the salt trail where the Union would have come up, the Confederacy, they are looking at thousands of soldiers coming up that hill. And again, the sacrifices when soldiers on both sides realized what was inevitable in terms of loss of life. It's just a very powerful place for me.
Cheatham Hill is definitely one of my favorites, especially the assault trail. The Union came up the hill like a blue wave. Knowing how the cannons worked, they had to take that step and go up that hill. These young men, most of them were in their late teens, early 20s. The things that they experienced and saw and went through, it's just very intense and just pulls at your heart. Their lives might have been different. They might have not had television or the electronics or anything like we do today, but they still had the same problems and the same struggles and fears that we have today. I don't know if I could have done it. It's a courage that no one understands, I guess, until you do it, and just the honor and reverence towards those before us, but also the ones that are with us today that are taking that sacrifice. You can find those little kind of nuggets all over the park, those little quiet spots that help you to reflect.
Before we move on to our next segment of this podcast, I would like to express a big thank you to Amanda Corman and Marjorie Thomas. Amanda Corman is a park ranger and a curator at the Kennesaw Mountain battlefield, and she took time out to talk to me for that previous segment. And Marjorie Thomas is the chief of interpretations at the Kennesaw Mountain National Battlefield. So I wanted to make sure I gave a big thank you for them to doing that interview way back when COVID was still a major factor in all of our lives. Very kind of her to do that, or both of them to do that. Now, this next part, we're going to dive a little deeper into the historiography. We're going to try to answer a question. And for those of you that don't know, historiography is just a fancy word for the history of history. Now, this next part of the podcast, we're going to be looking into why Sherman attacked. And I'm going to call this part of the segment, part of the podcast, Decision Point. And we're going to dive into why in the world Sherman had decided to make that attack. So I hope you'll enjoy this. This part will get into a little bit more detail on why this took place, and hopefully you'll find it interesting. So let's go ahead and dive in. Years ago, I heard a song by Claire Lynch about the Kennesaw line. And it was called, there was a line in there that said, "The day that hell broke loose just north of Mayetta along the Kennesaw line." And this was a great song that really did bring alive the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain and got me kind of interested in that song. And it was based on a letter from a Civil War soldier. And the tune is referencing a controversial assault launched by Union General William Tecumseh Sherman on June 27th, 1864. The Confederates had set up many impressive defenses along the Kennesaw Mountain line. It's about 60 miles from the ultimate goal of the critical Confederate railroad hub of Atlanta. Now, there had been many flanking maneuvers that Sherman had conducted to go around Joseph Johnston and kind of cut into the Confederate lines or Confederate territory in Atlanta. And this had taken place in the spring and summer of 1864 after William Tecumseh Sherman took over the Union Army around Chattanooga. And it seemed that Sherman had still taken a lot of territory without a significant loss of life, which no general wants to lose a lot of soldiers. So Sherman changed tactics suddenly around Kennesaw Mountain, and the result was 3,000 casualties, and it really didn't accomplish much, at least according to the newspapers at the time. A lot of people say this was the low point in Sherman's military career, even though he moved on to besiege and take Atlanta successfully. A lot of people kind of forgot about this attack, except those that had fought in it. But never again in Sherman's career did he order a significant frontal assault like this. So I think it's essential that we understand the reasons for Sherman's offensive to discover why he had discarded these previously successful flanking tactics. So, as with many decisions, Sherman considered numerous factors when contemplating an assault on the strong Confederate lines. In the end, it was pressure from Grant, who had been recently promoted. He was in command of all of the United States forces, but this exposed supply line that was vital to the Union troops deep in Georgia territory, he was worried about that, Sherman was, and he also wanted to remind the world that his army could attack rather than solely maneuver, and that was why he decided to try an attack on Kennesaw Mountain. So let's provide a little context here. The situation in the United States by the summer of 1864, it might have been one of the most precarious moments in the country's history. Locked in a seemingly endless civil war, these two embattled Union commanders, Sherman and Grant, under Lincoln, they appeared mired in costly campaigns doomed to result in only more bloodletting and carnage. Now, to worsen the grim situation, Lincoln, I think we mentioned this earlier in the podcast, but he faced a re-election campaign against his former general, George McClellan. George McClellan had been supported by the Copperheads, which was basically a peace platform. Think of them as the hippies of the 1860s. They wanted the war to end, and they thought the Confederate States of America would never give up, and we should just allow them, we being the United States, should just allow them to have their independence. By the summer of 1864, Grant had fought Confederate General Robert E. Lee into a impressive network of siege lines around Petersburg, Virginia, that also appeared impossible to break without unimaginable casualties. So at the beginning of that same season, Sherman writes that he was embarking on a campaign of extreme delicacy. It's his words. That would take him from Chattanooga to Atlanta. He recounts that his vast superiority allowed him to maneuver, but his opponent, Joseph Johnston, enjoyed an advantage because the ground in North Georgia, I don't know if any of you have ever been to North Georgia, but imagine tried to march through North Georgia with limited roads, and it would be very difficult. It's very hilly ground, lots of rivers, lots of creeks, that sort of thing. And at first, it looked like Sherman's brilliant maneuvering and swift flanking of Johnston's forces. Joseph Johnston was in charge of the Confederate Army defending Georgia, but Sherman had penetrated deep into Georgia before he suddenly slowed. The rains hit, there were muddy roads, overextended supply lines vulnerable to rebel cavalry, and Sherman appeared to slow down. Now, there had been casualties in the drive toward Atlanta, but soldiers on both sides, North and South, had fallen into this general belief that Sherman was never going to attack, that he would rather flank or besiege than lose men assaulting the rebel earthworks. See, the war had changed a lot by 1864. When the war started, it was all about honor and lining up and fighting like men, facing your enemy. And by 1864, men would dig trenches or build defenses, which at the beginning of the war was kind of seen as cowardly. So Sherman is going to change his attack or his plan in the summer of 1864. Now let's talk about this. Now Grant had made no attempt at hiding his overall strategy to end the Civil War as he took the helm of vast resources that the United States had. And the Confederate States of America, according to Grant, could not withstand a coordinated offensive on multiple fronts. Now, historian James McPherson's great writer, if you ever are interested in the Civil War, he believed that Grant spent his first months as lieutenant general concentrated on efforts to prevent the Confederate armies from reinforcing one another. In other words, Grant is going to launch a lot of attacks all at once. Now, as 1864 dragged on and the summer months saw no real victories, Grant had been caught in costly campaigns like the Wilderness and Spotsylvania campaign. Maybe we'll do a future episode of roaming history on Grant and these overland campaigns. But the leader of the federal armies across the country did not want to see reinforcements arrive from Virginia, or in Virginia, from Georgia, especially when it appeared that Lee had stalled him with his defenses, this impressive siege works, or trenches, around Petersburg. If you ever get a chance to go there, you can still see those trench lines. Historians Herman Hathaway and Archer Jones argued that Grant's primary objective, as he assumed the rank of lieutenant general, was to send Sherman down to Georgia, to invade Georgia, to prevent Joe Johnston from reinforcing the Army of Northern Virginia under Robert E. Lee. Hathaway and Jones devoted a significant portion of their work, How the North Won, to Grant's obsession with distracting and occupying the enemy on numerous fronts across the countryside. Using correspondence between Grant and Sherman to support this assessment, Hathaway and Jones provide ample evidence into Grant's state of mind regarding the importance of Sherman's advance into Georgia. Bearing witness to such precise and overwhelming evidence provides little doubt Sherman felt the pressure from his commanding officer when contemplating an attack on the seemingly unbeatable Confederate defenses at Kennesaw Mountain. Well, let's ask Sherman, what did he think about this attack? Well, Sherman said, quote, "One of my chief objects being to give full employment to Johnston. It makes but little difference where he is, so long as he is not on his way to Virginia." End quote. Later on, Sherman wrote to his brother, and this showcases his contention that the 1864 campaigns would result in the federal efforts to destroy the Confederates' ability to continue making war. Sherman viewed the new policy of Grant to orchestrate war on multiple fronts to be, quote, "an enlightened war," end quote. And the conflict in the spring of 1864 would be different from previous years in the destructive conflict. So Sherman had a lot of hope here, so he remained focused on the primary objective relayed by Grant, which was to fight Johnston while damaging the enemy's resources and prevent those reinforcements from coming to Virginia. Now, these revelations provide insight into Sherman's decision to hurl his soldiers into the defenses at Kennesaw Mountain, following weeks without significant action that may have been carried out to continue bringing this fight to Johnston. Historian Earl Hess, he discusses Sherman's nagging fear after weeks of flanking and maneuver that Johnston may decide that he had enough men to continue this type of warfare that he could send reinforcements to Virginia. You know, when you really take a look at Grant's memoirs, it seems that the overall goal of capturing the railroad hub of Atlanta became second to the assault on Johnston's forces, mainly to prevent those reinforcements from coming to Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. For example, in the previous fall of 1863, Confederate General James Longstreet had redeployed from Virginia to the Tennessee campaign. Grant planned to prevent this from happening again, and he placed pressure on his generals to press the attack to keep the rebel forces off balance. Sherman undoubtedly felt this importance from his commanding officer when contemplating the attack on Kennesaw Mountain as the campaign through Georgia appeared to be slowing to a crawl. The weather didn't help either. So you have these two forces that are used to maneuvering and not fighting, and you also have bad weather. Now, when you look at Sherman's daily communication with President Abraham Lincoln's chief of staff, Henry Halleck, this reveals a constant concern about the Confederate supply lines, defenses, and the ability to reposition troops from one theater to another. Sherman even stated that Grant had his hands full against Lee in Virginia. Researching the consistent consultation with Halleck reveals the intense pressure that Sherman felt in the days and weeks leading up to the decision to attack Kennesaw Mountain on June 7, 1864. Now that flanking appeared dangerous because of the exposed supply lines, and Johnston seemed to command the landscape with his impressive breastworks along the Kennesaw line, the rebels may capitalize on this apparent lull in the fighting to send forces to help Lee in Virginia. While Sherman coped with the pressure from Washington to press the attack, every mile the Union Army penetrated into enemy territory brought a renewed series of logistical challenges. Union victories in 1863 had given birth to military weaknesses, such as the vast swath of conquered territory the Federal soldiers now had to occupy. Now, going back to the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian James McPherson, he talked about these logistical challenges that Sherman faced and continued to kind of dive into how many soldiers and how many cavalry units and U.S. soldiers Sherman had to devote to defending the supply lines, to the point where when you got to the front lines, the Union Army no longer enjoyed a superiority or an advantage in numbers. Sherman contemplated the logistical dangers of an invading army in enemy territory, exposing the ever-lengthening supply lines to guerrillas of an exasperated people, his words. Sherman argues the Confederates gained strength with every withdrawal, picking up reinforcements as they approached their supplies. So they kept getting closer to their supply base, which Sherman was worried about. Now, by the time the Union leaders faced the decision regarding an attack on Johnston's impressive defenses, Sherman writes that the supply lines had stretched as far as possible. In other words, he couldn't go any farther. Now, as a result, he believed an attack on the rebel center was necessary. Now, natural elements did not help Sherman's situation. As I mentioned, torrential rains, made the advance worse, and the terrain in North Georgia had little or no roads, and this required his army to improvise their supply lines. The rural countryside morphed into a collage of muddy fields and slushy paths, and Sherman discussed the horrible conditions facing his army in Georgia as June 1864 progressed. Now, despite the forward momentum slowing to a crawl, Sherman had repeatedly discussed the necessity of maintaining the morale of the offensive. And even though the rain had slowed the march, he argued the weather had an excellent effect on the troops as it gave a respite to the intense summer heat. However, Sherman became concerned with another development he began to notice in his soldiers. In his memoirs, he revealed that the methodical march of his men had given birth to the habit of entrenching every time they stopped marching. So Sherman started to wonder, did his men no longer believe that he would launch an attack if necessary? Now, the possibility of his troops losing their fighting spirit nagged at him as he dealt with the pressure from his superiors and the vulnerability of the ever-lengthening supply lines. So are you seeing this combination of things going on here? His troops seemed to lose their fighting spirit. He had an pressure from his superiors, and then he had an ever-lengthening supply line that he had to defend. Now, before we continue on here, I'd like to just notice or make note of an observation by Hathaway and Jones, and I've always found this really interesting, and I'd never thought about this until I read their book. But Sherman also, the reason he didn't believe in these frontal assaults up until this point is he thought that the rebels in the West, meaning Georgia, the Western Theater was Georgia and west of there, these rebels did not require the slaughter of Grant's battles in Virginia. And the reason is very interesting. It's an interesting thing to contemplate, but Sherman believed that the Virginians needed evidence that the Union armies would fight with spirit, where the Western Confederates were well aware of the abilities of the North. And the reason is, if you're not a Civil War historian, that's fine, but you may not know this, but the rebels in the West had been defeated over and over and over again. In fact, there was only one major victory for the rebels in the West, and that was the Battle of Chickamauga in North Georgia that had taken place about a year before Sherman's attack on Kennesaw Mountain. Now, years later, Sherman actually said that his men would have won the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain if his soldiers and officers had not grown accustomed to flanking. Now, I thought that was, he basically blames his men, which you don't see very often with soldiers and or with generals. And I thought you would think that was kind of interesting. So there were other historians that said that the soldiers had become kind of used to flanking. Now, there were regiments like the 38th Indiana Veteran Volunteer Infantry Regiment that entered the battle with determination and perseverance to fight. And they wanted to fight against the rebels, according to some of the veterans. The men of the 38th repeatedly drove back the rebels until the day they assaulted the Southerners under intense artillery and musket fire that halted them. Lieutenant Colonel D.F. Griffin of the 38th said there was great importance in his mind on duty, and he said the men's energy and cheerfulness led many to believe that the attack on Kennesaw Mountain was a victory was probable because the men were excited about it. Now, another Union soldier in the 9th Iowa, Edwin Oberham, he supported Sherman's decision to attack the rebel positions at Kennesaw Mountain. He wrote letters to his sister. Edwin said it became evident that with many of his comrades that a frontal assault would be necessary to dislodge the Confederates from their positions along Kennesaw Line. And these letters described campaigns in Tennessee and Georgia, that gave a good glimpse into overall morale and viewpoint of the Union soldiers under Sherman's command. Now, the situation before these Confederate defenses at Kennesaw Mountains, they resembled the fringes of hell, according to one historian. So it was not, everyone knew it was going to be an attack against a determined foe. Sherman would, of course, face many critics about this attack, which every general is going to face. They thought that it was careless. They thought that he didn't adequately plan the attack. But Sherman did not make this decision without intense planning. He wanted to limit the risks and maximize the potential for victory. Earl Hess, a historian we mentioned earlier, he explained that Sherman believed the attack would have succeeded if his soldiers and officers had not grown accustomed to the flanking maneuver. Now, the official records of the War of the Rebellion show that Sherman consulted with his officers and determined that a flanking maneuver, even if he wanted to do it, even if he wanted to go around Johnston's flank, would be impossible. Sherman's subordinates prepared for the attack for days after Sherman made the decision. It was not something that they decided one morning and carried out the attack the next day or even a couple hours later. No, they planned for days. And Sherman ordered the assault with about a fifth of his force. And this was something that he hoped maybe Johnston had established his lines too thin to repulse the assault. Now, of course, it's going to be a failure, and Sherman is not going to have another frontal assault as he continues on his march to the sea. Now, on the grand scale in the Civil War in the entire nation, the fighting at Kennesaw Mountain was like a footnote to the rest of the country, except for the fallen soldiers that had died there. The greater spotlight would be Sherman's taking of Atlanta, which would happen approximately 2 or 3 months later. Now, it's possible that Sherman may have tried an attack on Atlanta if he had not learned his lesson about frontal assaults, but he never really launched another attack like this one. But there were no immediate gains when the sun set on June 27, 1864. Johnston would soon be fired for the more aggressive choice of John Bell Hood, and the rebels never sent any reinforcements from Georgia to Virginia. So the funny thing is, we know now that there had been no legitimate Confederate consideration of shifting troops from one theater to the other. So in the end, Kennesaw Mountain had little effect on the ultimate goal of Atlanta. So I've always found this interesting, though, that in a campaign that was marked by lots of flanking, lots of maneuver, there was one major attack. And I've had lots of students ask me about this over the years, wondering why this attack took place. I've even taken students and walked them along these trails. And I find it really interesting because there's not a good answer until you start looking at it. And Sherman, it's easy to look back. Hindsight's always 20/20. But many veterans, I think that's always the best source that we have on whether something was worth it. Now, many veterans described the attack on Kennesaw Mountain as a necessary experiment. Now, it didn't have a lot of an impact on the overall campaign, but these veterans said that it needed to be tried. And many veterans returned to the Kennesaw Mountain, and that's one of the reasons we have Kennesaw Mountain preserved so well, is because there's a lot of monuments on the Kennesaw Mountain battlefield to Union regiments. So this is something that I hope that this has explained why this attack took place. And Sherman was basically wanting to try something for a lot of different reasons. But he ended up flanking after the attack on Kennesaw Mountain, and Johnston ultimately had to withdraw back to the defenses around Atlanta. So I hope you found that part of this interesting. So in future episodes, we're going to dive into things that are not war-related. We are going to be roaming through history, as the title suggests. So I hope that you have found this interesting, and I hope you have learned a little bit about the Kennesaw Mountain battlefield. Please come visit the Kennesaw Mountain battlefield. It's one of the best preserved battlefields in Georgia. Chickamauga is also a good one. So in our next episode, we are going to be diving in some different parts of history. So in the meantime, drop me a line, follow me on Twitter, check me out on Instagram if you want to talk about history. If you have any ideas for future episodes, please let me know. Sometimes we may get a historian on here to talk about their books. We're going to be just roaming through history, and I hope you're going to find that you have a newfound interest of history. So now you know a little bit about why Sherman decided to launch an impossible attack on Kennesaw Mountain 160 years ago at the time of this recording. I wish you all the best. Keep smiling out there, and always know that history is all around us. And drop me a line and tell me what history that you are seeing, and maybe we can walk through this wonderful thing called history together. Have a great rest of your day or evening whenever you're listening to this, and I will see you next time. Keep smiling.